Napoleon Bonaparte.
Right.
But who, but
You.
who, but who swung the deal? A guy I never heard of, and he was a Frenchman.
Uh-huh.
And there is a statue of him. There's one in St. Louis somewhere, and at Jefferson City, it's a group statue. A statue of it says the signing of the Louisiana Treaty, of the signing of the Louisiana Treaty,
Mm-hmm.
and it's got future President Monroe and a guy named Livingston, who was the ambassador to France,
Uh-huh.
and a guy who was an aristocrat. He was called a Marquis Barbé Marbois. It's a hyphenated
Mm-hmm.
last name, and all. He was the finance minister for Napoleon.
Oh,
But
wow.
what he did was he persuaded Napoleon to sell the United States all the vast territory. We just wanted to buy New Orleans.
Right.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he said, but this guy Barbé Marbois, he said, let's just sell it all to the Americans, because if we don't, the British or somebody and the Spanish are going to get it.
Right.
We can't hold on to it. It's too vast an area. It stretches from New Orleans all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
Includes all the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers and the Rocky Mountains and all. He said, let's just sell it all. And he was one of the best friends that the United States ever had. And most people probably never heard of him.
Right.
And I had never heard of him.
Right.
He had been the King of France's representative to the United States in the American Revolution. He was on a first-name basis with Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all of them. So years later, when we go to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, they go to Paris, they sit down at the table, and who's on the other side of the table? This guy who absolutely loved the United States and who married an American, and just
Mm-hmm.
like Lafayette, he thought the United States was one of the greatest ideas of all time, and
it is.
So a lot of these.
you got lucky. You talk about profit.
Oh, well, I tell you, that was the best purchase that the United States made, you know?
A lot of the stories that you're talking about, that's covered in the book.
Yeah, that's in there, and of course, there's a lot of some of the Civil War stories are really interesting.
For example?
Well, there's a guy, Missouri. They always talk about how in the Civil War, it was family against family and town versus town. That wasn't true in most places, but it was better more than any place else. You literally had where I'm from along the Missouri River there. You had one town was Confederate, and the next town was Union.
Right.
And of course, St. Louis was famously very pro-Union, but other parts of the state were pro-Confederacy. We had two different governments.
Right.
And so Missourians, they fought it out town by town. And if and the Union won, if the Confederacy had won, I don't think there'd be a United States. Because Missouri was an important state.
Yes, it was.
It had all the lead mining, and it had all the industry around St. Louis, and it just strategically with the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, it just I don't think the country would have held together if Missouri had fallen into the hands of the Confederacy. But one of the last people, Confederate generals, was a Missourian named Joe Shelby.
Mm-hmm.
He was down along the Missouri River more towards Kansas City. But he had his Missouri cavalry. And at the end of the war,
Mm-hmm.
and the United States had won, the Union had won, he was the last rebel. He would not surrender. And he famously took his cavalry, and they held out in Mexico for, at some point. they gave up.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, what message or takeaway do you hope readers, after the experience of reading Show Me Missouri and Missourians, what message do you hope they take away?
Well, I hope they take away as Missourians. I don't think a lot of people in Maine and Michigan are going to run out and buy the book. I hope they do, but it's basically aimed at Missourians. This goes back to what I said. We just don't get much storytelling outside of big metropolitan areas now, and so I think one message you would get is how varied a state like Missouri is. It's its history, its rural areas, its farms, the Ozarks, all of that, and so we got a lot of stories to tell. They always said there's a million stories in the big city. Well, there's a million stories in the small towns too. So
Absolutely.
and I got the sports in there too. So I got
Oh, that's
Ken
terrific.
Musial and Albert Pujols, and I got everybody in there. It's mostly illustrations.
Well, that's what I was going to ask
artwork.
you about, your original artwork. Why use original artwork today? I mean, instead of using photography.
Well, that's a good question, and I'll tell you why. And I've worked in all of it. Talked about advertising. I worked in advertising, and I've done tons of photography. I carried a camera for 40 years. I was my own photographer, But I saw a statistic that said every day there's 1 billion photographs uploaded from cameras and all. 1 billion from phones.
Wow.
And if there's 1 billion pictures out there and everybody in the world's taking pictures, maybe if you're going to get people's attention, maybe it's time to try something different. And I thought, well, original artwork can do some things that photography cannot do. For one
Absolutely.
thing, there wasn't any photography back in the days of the Louisiana Purchase.
Right.
Back in those days, and there are other things. There was a famous case in Kansas City at Union Station where there was this gang boss named with a wonderful name of Pretty Boy Floyd. Pretty Boy Floyd. He was in conflict with the FBI and the Kansas City police, and they had a guy they had arrested, and the police had him, and they were bringing him through the Union Station. Well, he and his gang pulled up there with submachine guns, and it's called the Kansas City Massacre.
Oh my goodness.
And they shot 6 or 8 people, FBI agents and police and all. There's no pictures of that, but there's descriptions of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so with a little bit of research, you can pretty much reproduce that, and all that's reproduced in the book. So there's a lot of things you can't do with
Wow.
Yeah.
camera because there wasn't any camera there.
Right.
You're listening to Guy Allen Bob from Author's Edge, chatting with Larry W. Waterfield.
Now, you also wrote a book called Metropolis at War, London. Tell us about that.
Well, I was always interested in history, and particularly European and English history, and the war years. And of course, there've been thousands, and who knows, I'm looking up World War II.
Right.
So I said, well, why write one more? And I'm not going to write one more. I said, I'm going to pick, instead of all these grand strategies with Eisenhower and Roosevelt and Churchill and all, I want to know what was going on in London, which was under attack for 5 years.
Yeah.
What was going on day to day? What were the people doing?
Oh,
The ordinary people and well-known people and less well-known people. And what was life like when you were at war for all that time and totally mobilized? And so that was the genesis.
Well, my husband and I just took a trip to Europe. And we went to one of the places we went to was London, and one of the most one of the best exhibits that we saw there was the Churchill War Rooms. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, I know exactly. It's down there in the government
Yes, that
district.
was
And
amazing because they took you through everything that went on during the war.
yeah,
And it was just the amount of information and the way. And the thing is that when we were there, when they left that room at the end of the war. They left that. It's not one room really. It's a huge exhibit, but they left it exactly the way it was. Their coffee cups are still sitting on the tables.
yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about, and a lot of that's in the London book. There were a number of places like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Americans the British built, I think, underneath one of the biggest department stores in the world. They built in the deepest basement. They built a facility there for the Americans, so the Americans could communicate with Washington.
Whoa!
And Washington D.C. and all.
Was that
and
under?
Also have a link to the President of the United States. Well,
is it still
the
there?
Germans were firing at the end of the war. Were firing these V2 rockets. Those rockets were the beginning of the space age.
Right.
Those rockets were the forerunners to the rockets that went to the moon. One of those rockets penetrated down into that department store through several basements and wiped out that facility.
Oh, it did. What department store was it? Do you know what department store it was?
Yeah, I think it's the famous one owned by the Selfridge.
Oh, that wouldn't be the Harrods then. That wouldn't be Harold. Harrods?
Harrods.
No, Harrods is the famous. But the Selfridges, there was a TV set.
Right.
A series about it because it was a department store that had been started by an American. And it's there on Oxford Street.
Yeah, you were talking about the experience of the individuals living through the bombardment. Can you elaborate on the personal stories you chose to highlight? Why were they significant?
I was interested in people who, what ordinary people were doing during the war.
And what were they doing? And what were they doing?
Connection.
What were they doing?
St. Louis connection.
Oh, okay. But what were the Londoners doing?
Well, the guy there who actually was born in St. Louis, but he was a Londoner.
Oh, okay.
His name was T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Right.
He was from St. Louis. He loved St. Louis. He loved the river and considered him, the Eliot family there. And but he was living in London at the time, and his job, he was a air raid warden. He'd run around at night and tell everybody, you turn your lights out, pull your shades. We can't see any. If you see any light at all, you're in big trouble.
Oh my!
So he was doing jobs like that. Michael Caine, who was a famous actor, he was a Londoner, and he was a kid. And of course, they evacuated more than 1 million children.
Yes, I've read several stories about that.
Yeah, and that's in several books and all. They evacuated them to the countryside, and he was one of the ones who was evacuated.
What were they in? Just camps, and?
Well, they would send them out to people's homes.
Oh, okay.
There were several
people would say, we can take, 2 kids, send them here. And so they would, they take them down to the train station, put a tag on them, and where they were going, and ship them out, and somebody would pick them up and take care of them, I guess, till they were able to go back home. And so the other one of the favorite things, you talk about food. See, the British were in an interesting situation. They only had produced enough food for half their people.
Right.
Everything else was imported.
Right.
Every day, 365 days a year, they had to import nationwide, enough food for 25 million people every day.
Wow.
And so they were subject to starvation, and they knew it. So in order to save food, and of course the Germans had set up this ring of submarines to sink any ships. So they concocted some of the most amazing dishes that you could ever imagine, meatless dishes, and sort of weird dish made up very coarse grains and all.
Yeah.
And they print them up in recipes and all this to try to.
Do you include any of those recipes in your book?
I do. I have some of the recipes and some of the concoctions that they came up with.
Can you give us an example of one?
You know, I off the top of my head, there was one that was quite famous, and the guy who was head of the food system there, the Minister of Agriculture and all, they named it after him, and it was not meant as a compliment. And it was kind of almost like it was a meatless meat pie. I guess very coarse grain. You'd bake it, fill it with whatever you could if you could find vegetables, some kind of a vegetable. I think it was probably pretty awful. That's why they named it kind of, sarcastically named it after the guy who was in charge.
Yeah.
You know, but I got recipes like that in the book. You know, it wiped out the railway system.
Yes.
Private railway system wiped them out. It wiped out the restaurant trade. It wiped out the hotels. Bad price. You couldn't charge more than equivalent of about $9 for a restaurant meal.
Right.
In today's money. So all the fancy restaurants, they were finished.
Right.
There was no dining on in the trains and all. And a lot of times they set up sort of impromptu restaurants where you go and you get soup or something.
Right.
Bread and soup, you know. So always think of Americans, you know, we've never done without food, and we eat well. We eat almost too well.
Yeah.
In many cases, and then
but then but during World War II, we did have rationing. We did have, we
discovered processed foods.
We did. We discovered processed foods.
Yeah, well, my hometown at Moberly, Missouri, that's where they made a lot of that processed food.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were making powdered eggs.
Oh, those
That's
are
kind
so
of where
yucky.
one of the first ever TV dinners was made. The banquet foods. You still, so my dad worked for them. You still see them in the stores.
Actually, I want to tell you that whenever I go, sometimes I go and visit my mom who lives in Arizona, and my husband is home by himself. He will go and buy banquet fried chicken with mashed potatoes. He loves that.
And corn.
And corn, yes.
Yes.
And then whatever that dessert thing is, I don't know what that dessert thing is. It's nondescript.
It doesn't move.
It doesn't move, and it's terribly nondescript. But anyway, yes, that is his favorite. He will get that, and he will just And it's sometimes when I come home and I'll see that it's like 3 or 4 of them in the freezer, and I'm like, really?
Well, your writing style is known for its brevity and directness. How did you adapt your signature style to capture the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the Blitz of London? I mean, how did you make that happen?
Well, I think, I guess there's I suppose you could say that in some ways that's journalistic writing, for better or for worse. They always said that was Hemingway's secret, that, he had worked on the Kansas City Star, and sort of picked up that,
I knew that.
direct and declarative sentences and all, and get right to the point. Lead paragraph.
Right.
Bring people right into the story.
The Blitz was a time of immense loss and destruction. How do you strike a balance between portraying the horrors of war and providing a sense of hope and determination? You know, it was a horrific time for the Londoners. And
Right.
how did you strike? It's so easy, I think. It's so easy to delve into the horror and kind of not think about too much of the hope part. So how did you
Yeah.
strike a good balance between those two?
Well, I think that one of the main reasons is that human beings are just adaptable and resilient. You know,
Yeah, good point.
what happened was, and I think why Germany lost the war happened really early on. Their strategy was they were going to knock out the British Air Force,
Mm-hmm.
and then they could take out the Navy because there would be no protection. Then they were going to invade Britain. They had a many thousand page long plan. They knew, we're going to set up a headquarters in this hotel. We're going to take over this. They
Mm-hmm.
knew everything. We're going to arrest the intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
They had it all planned out, right down. But the first part was to take out the Royal Air Force.
Right.
But Churchill, London was being bombed, or they hadn't started bombing London yet, but Britain was being bombed. The airfields and all were being. Churchill told his bomber command, the guy who was head of his bomber command, he said, "You've got to strike back at Berlin. I don't care how you do it. It may not be. Maybe it's only one plane.
Right.
We've got to do it." And they did. It was a meaningless raid as far as the war goes, but they got through at night and they dropped some bombs on Berlin. Didn't do much damage, but it just enraged the Nazi regime, and they said, well, "Okay, we're going to take out London. We're going to take it out in revenge." And so they stopped worrying about the Royal Air Force and all.
Yeah.
And they turned to bombing, terror bombing of London, which was a terrible mistake. They thought the guy head of the German Air Force, Goering, he said, "We're going to drive Londoners. We're going to drive them insane." But that didn't happen.
Right.
Instead, as a famous poster says, what is it? Just keep calm and carry on.
Right. Right. Well, Larry, I have
That's
to.
what they did, and I think a lot of people are able to do.
Yeah.
It's
Larry,
amazing what's going on in Ukraine. Right? It's
Yeah.
a mini World War II.
Right. Well, Larry, I have to do a radio identifier. You are listening to Author's Edge with Gael Freer and Bob Price, coming to you weekly on Saturdays on KWRH 92.9 and KXOK 102.9 FM, and Monday to Friday, 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. nationwide on My Genre Radio Network. And then I want to add a couple of publishing tips or writing tips in here. One of the biggies is when you have writer's block. And writer's block happens to a lot of people. So I've got 11 tips real quick. 1, change your environment. If you normally write at home, write in a coffee shop. If you write in your bedroom, write in the living room, but change your environment. 2, do something else. Go for a walk, take a shower, clean the house. Try anything to get your brain to reevaluate and just blank out what you've been doing. So before long, you'll be writing again. Number 3, try a writing prompt related to your work. So if you're writing historical fiction, try and find something that's related to that historical fiction and start writing again. Number 4, take a break from writing. Give yourself permission not to have to go back to writing. And those are my tips for today. Okay. So, Larry, where are you going from here?
Well, I've always got a bunch of things. I think time will run out before I run out of ideas. In some ways, that's a curse. every time I read something or look at something or travel somewhere, I said, that'd make a great story. So it sounds like a blessing, but it's not a blessing, it's a curse in many ways because, first of all, there's no time to do all the things you want to do.
Absolutely.
But I've got a lot of irons.
Like what? Give us an example of what you're.
Is there another book that you're working on currently?
I've probably got a half a dozen things I'm working on.
Oh, you're one of those, are you?
At any one time.
A multitasker.
So give us an
but
example.
I do a lot of it's illustrations also. I've got a number of collections of illustrations that much like the Missouri book.
Oh,
And
are you going to do something like that for another state?
I won't do it for a state. I'd actually I traveled in the South for all those years, so I did a lot of things. I call it the Southern Journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I have that, and also the American West. I've done a lot. New York City, and of course, live in Washington. I've done a lot on. I did put together a book on. Won't have time for this story, but I put together a story on Arlington National Cemetery.
Oh.
And got it all together, and I had a publisher in New York City. And his name was Stewart, and I met with him in Manhattan and all, and sat out and talked for a long time. And he said, it's a good idea and all. He said, why don't you kind of pre-market it yourself? You got all the military there and all. I said, I got a full-time job. I don't have time to publish. You're the publisher. You market.
Larry, I know two excellent publishers. One of them is Doug Sykes from Acclaim Publishing.
Right.
And the other one is myself. I do publishing as well. So,
good.
Yes. So you've got two people there that you can go to. Larry,
anyway, I was just going to say that the guy, Stewart, I didn't know who he was. He was a nice guy and all. But anyway, he had just, not too long after that, he divorced his wife, and his wife, looking for something to do, she started a catering business. Mm-hmm. Her name is Martha Stewart.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
Well, all right.
Hey, Larry, it's been a real pleasure having you on.
It's been a pleasure
You're
having you.
You're full of stories. You've been everywhere.
Yes. So thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate that. Thank you all for tuning in to Author's Edge. Tune in again next week for more tips, resources, and your favorite conversations. Our next guest will be Paul Bass, and we'll be chatting about Missouri inventors and Fort Leonard Wood. Till then, see you around the inkwell. And again, Larry, thank you so much. We'll be chatting soon. You have a good day.
Thanks, Larry.
Bye.
Funding for many of our programs are provided through generous donations from listeners like you. And now the latest world and national news.
From Feature Story News in Washington, I'm Caroline Malone. The U.S. state of Vermont has begun recovery operations following catastrophic storms over the past few days. Vermont's capital, Montpelier, was submerged in water, and authorities are now considering the longer-term costs. A flood watch remains in effect for parts of New York, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Connecticut states. Jody Jacobs reports.
Starting on Wednesday, crews are planning to clear debris and inspect buildings in Montpelier. Residents there and in nearby Berlin have been told to boil their water, with concerns that the flooding may have contaminated their drinking water. Vermont Governor Phil Scott says this has been the most historic and catastrophic flooding in the area. He has urged caution over the coming days, saying this is nowhere near over. More rain is expected later this week in the area, with storms on its way across the northeast and New England starting on Thursday. Jody Jacobs, New York.
In South Africa, it's cold weather causing problems as power utility company Eskom says it's unable to meet a sudden increase in demand due to the drop in temperatures. Cold weather triggered a 10% increase in electricity consumption. Scheduled power outages will remain in place until Eskom's generating capacity has improved. Mark Roughton reports.
Analysts have been warning that South Africa's power utility is not yet generating enough electricity to cope with peak winter demand. After almost a month of minimal interruptions, Eskom says that the return to stage 6 levels of scheduled power cuts became necessary after the overnight loss of several generating units, coupled with extensive use of open-cycle gas turbines and an inability to fully replenish pumped storage facilities. Mark Roughton, South Africa.
And in the UK, almost 1 million households face a monthly mortgage repayment increase of £500 or $650. Simon Gaitan reports.
The Bank of England announced on Wednesday that mortgage payments are expected to rise by over £500